historically, and a lot of people would associate this with like European wines, but historically, even European culture, you would buy wine and you would cellar it and you'd put it in your cellar for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. People buy, birth wines of their children and they save them for decades. And for wine that is going to be stored in that manner and consumed in that fashion, it unquestionably needs a glass bottle and a cork. But that percentage of the total wine that's produced and consumed on an average basis is arguably less than 5%. And so, and some of these numbers, they vary so much from year to year, et cetera. But a very, very safe number is over 90% of the wine that is produced on an annual basis and bottled on an annual basis is consumed in less than 12 months. The vast majority of the trillions of bottles of wine that we globally produce don't need glass. They just don't need it at all. And when I started to kind of come to that realization, blending consumer habits with the impact of that glass bottle, that was when it was like, holy crap.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has the goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of their process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 135 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, packaging design takes center stage. Packaging is often top of mind in terms of waste for many consumers, and we've discussed what goes into changing packaging, the issues with plastics or compostables, and even how companies can reduce their packaging altogether. But today, we're taking a critical look at one type of packaging that is often hailed as an eco-hero: glass. More specifically, we compare the sustainability and functionality of glass versus aluminum within the world of wine. To help break down some of the key differences, I'm joined by Jake Bilbro. With winemaking in his blood and the outdoors in his heart, Jake created Revelshine with the hope of bringing wine beyond the boundaries of the traditional table in the most sustainable manner possible to celebrate the beauty of the world and the people around us. Awesome. So thank you for joining me on the Outdoor Minimalist podcast today, Jake. I am excited to have you on the show and talk about all things Revelshine wines. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit more about your background so people can get to know you. So how did you get involved in outdoor recreation and how does it fit into your life now?
Well, really quickly, thank you for having me, Meg. I very much appreciate it, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's an interesting question about how I got involved in outdoor recreation, as if you were to ask me how did I get involved in wine, because I think it would be a chicken or an egg. My dad was passed away a few years ago, but my dad was my very best friend in the entire world. He was an extraordinary outdoorsman, and he was also an extraordinary winemaker. And when I grew up, I was completely immersed in the world of wine. My brothers and I used to play hide and go seek tag in my dad's winery. We would, I would drive vineyards and check grapes and check fruit with him nonstop. I constantly lived within my normal life was winery and vineyard heavy. And at the same time, my normal life entailed abalone diving, spear fishing, foraging for mushrooms, a huge garden, skiing, hiking. My dad, if you had asked me the definition of a winemaker, I definitively would not have said someone who works in a lab and has, test tubes and runs runs tests on wines, it would have been someone who is just actively engaged and in love with the outdoors, and then happens to kind of always have a bottle of wine with them wherever they are.
Yeah, and so has that just kind of carried over into what inspired Revelshine wines, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I grew up, in my family. I left for college. I came home. I worked my way back into the wine industry, surprisingly, and I worked with my dad for 16 years. Branched out and started my own winery in the traditional space. And for my entire adult life, I have been a winemaker and a winery owner, and in the wine industry. But about 3 years ago was when Revelshine came to be, and when my wife, who was a professional triathlete, who in and of her own right is the most extraordinary outdoors person that I've ever met. She's an absolute mountain goat and climbs. If she sees a mountain, she's going to climb to the top of it. And if she's in her flip flops, it doesn't matter. She's just ready to go. And we talked a lot about how come in all of the places that we love to be the most, and if we want to celebrate and kind of commemorate a moment in those places, our options, if we want to do that with a beverage, consist of craft beer or whiskey out of a flask. How come we can't have wine in these places? And what we really kind of honed in on was, glass is not conducive to a lot of places outside. That led into a huge journey of its own, which helped me to become much more versed in sustainability and the environmental impacts of glass in the wine industry. And there's a lot of different channels of the river we can take off of that. But it was about 3 years ago where honestly we just wanted to, you know, enjoy the sunset a little bit more, or enjoy watching our kids skiing down a mountain a little bit more at the end of the day. And we didn't have what was true for us, in a nice glass of wine to share that, to enjoy that with.
Yeah, the two things seem very intertwined throughout your whole life and in the inspiration for like this specific avenue for wines. And sustainability seems like a big focus for the brand, right? Like a big part of why you wanted to start the business and like has grown with time. So, what would you say are some of the primary aspects within wine production and distribution that have the biggest impact and you wanted to improve with your brand?
Yeah, I mean, and with this being the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, I can tell you we are. I often say that we're a sustainability brand masked as an outdoor brand. Um, if if you and I spend an hour long on a podcast talking about, carbon footprint and recycling and relative recyclability of varying products, I think most of your listeners' eyes would glaze over, or more importantly, their ears would glaze over. Um, if we talk about how wonderful it is to be in the out of doors in a environmentally responsible way, and if we also talk about the fact that some of our equity partners and some of my partners in this, who are amazing outdoors people of their own rights, it adds a level of interest, and it allows you to kind of move a sustainability story forward. And so that's kind of some backstory on how those two overlapped. And so while we really entered into Revelshine and this idea from the utility of the product, it's unquestionable, but what we came to was this realization that if you look at the entire wine industry, and that incorporates all of the agricultural aspects of farming grapes, it incorporates all of the production that occurs in a winery, it incorporates all the bottling, and then all of the transportation to get that wine out to a grocery store or a wine shop, to where you may go and get that bottle and take it home and enjoy it. That's a multi-year umbrella that covers all of that under one bottle. And so, a bottle of red wine, that story actually started about 2 years prior, when that wine was grapes in a vineyard. So that entire 2-year process 70% of the carbon footprint of that entire 2-year process is tied up in the glass bottle and the packaging. And so when we really came to that realization, and when we really looked at how can we make an impact, and we support, exclusively organic and sustainably minded farmers with the grapes that we buy, and regenerative farming and all of the impacts that has. But really, that doesn't hold a candle compared to the bottle. And in fact, all of the efforts that you put forth on that front, which are costly, time consuming, everything else, if you then take that fruit that you've put all of that effort into and you bottle it into a glass bottle, you've negated all of that effort and then some. And so for us, the goal was to not, to not negate that 30% impact that we can have in other areas, but to absolutely focus on the 70% impact of the bottle. And what really became astounding, I don't want to over dramatize it, but astounding, was we looked further into consumer consumption habits in the wine industry. And historically, and a lot of people would associate this with like European wines, but historically, even European culture, you would buy wine and you would cellar it, and you'd put it in your cellar for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. People buy, birth wines of their children, and they save them for decades. And for wine that is going to be stored in that manner and consumed in that fashion, it unquestionably needs a glass bottle and a cork. But that percentage of the total wine that's produced and consumed on an average basis is arguably less than 5%. And so, and some of these numbers, they vary so much from year to year, et cetera. But a very, very safe number is over 90% of the wine that is produced on an annual basis and bottled on an annual basis is consumed in less than 12 months. The vast majority of the trillions of bottles of wine that we globally produce don't need glass. They just don't need it at all. And when I started to kind of come to that realization, blending consumer habits with the impact of that glass bottle, that was when it was like, holy crap. I mean, and I really used a stronger word than crap, but I'm being sensitive to your podcast here. It was just like, because I realized unwittingly that I was a significant contributor to that problem. And I made in my old world, I made very, quality oriented wine. I made wine that I intended for people to age and that was ageable, but I knew darn well that the majority of it was being consumed. And so when you look at wine in a grocery store, when you look at wine in a restaurant, all of that wine is purchased and turned as fast as possible. And all of those are just examples for anyone who just happens to not know it the way that I know it. But all of that wine could be in something other than aluminum, or excuse me, other than glass. And most preferably that would be in aluminum.
That's so fascinating. So is the predominant use for packaging with wine still glass? And is that just because of the historical ties in the wine industry?
Yeah, and it's just amazing. So yes, hands down, yes. The vast, vast, vast majority, again, easily 90% of the wine produced is still bottled in glass. And I had a really interesting conversation. It was actually a podcast, and it was with another outdoor entity, a very good friend of mine named Jonathan, who's got it's random. He predominantly reviews skis, and he reviews mountain bikes and for whatnot. But he and I talked about Revelshine on a podcast, and he said it in the most succinct and profound way. He's like, gosh, your wine quality is just as good. When looking at Revelshine, your wine quality is great. Your pricing is great. Your packaging is, from a utility perspective, makes more sense. You can take wine more places. It's a complete no-brainer when you build in the sustainability issue. Like, every single thing about this makes total sense. But you're dealing with an illogical scenario because you have to change hearts and minds. And hearts and minds are not logical. And hearts and minds for a century plus have said that wine comes in glass. And so it's a very interesting and challenging endeavor that we've undertaken, because on any argument that's logical, I think I can go in and just kind of win it hands down as to why I've got a great product and everyone should be buying it. But I'm not dealing with a logical argument here. And so it's very different.
Yeah, I think that there would probably be a lot of assumptions about the wine, seeing that it is in an aluminum container because people are so used to getting it in a glass bottle. And that's like, is the quality as good? There'd be like a lot of questions that I think could turn a lot of consumers away without them actually knowing the backstory to all of that. So I think it's important and good that you're communicating those things so clearly. And so let's talk a little bit about your choice of packaging then. So you mentioned that you use aluminum packaging. So that choice is tied to the sustainability. But what were some of the challenges involved in choosing a more sustainable package? And then how did you eventually land on aluminum?
So we originally landed on aluminum for the utility. And I look at Revelshine, and I don't think that we are a part of the canned wine market. And so I say that for a number of reasons. Number one, it was imperative to me that we bottle our wine in a multi-serving package. Um, you know, Meg, if you and I were having this conversation in real life, and if it were 70 degrees and beautiful outside and we finished, and I'm like, wow, this has been really great. I've really enjoyed this. Can I share a glass of wine with you, Meg? And I hand you a Red Bull can. That's one experience. If I take the time to open an unbreakable bottle that's made out of aluminum, and I open it and I pour it into a Yeti tumbler if we're outside, or whatever other, glass or functional type of cup or glass, and I share it with you, that's an entirely different experience. You can now smell it, you can taste it, you can savor it. It's a traditional wine experience. And one of the things that I wanted, that I thought was very important, because we're dealing with hearts and minds, was you can't divorce yourself from your largest set of consumers, which are existing wine drinkers. And existing wine drinkers, there's a culture to drinking wine, and it's sharing. Sharing is very, very important. Wine is always served, in a 750 milliliter bottle that holds 5 to 6 glasses of wine, and you pour glasses and you share it. And there's also something else about wine, that wine is slow. Wine takes its time. Wine is something that you sip. It's not slamming a shot of tequila, and it's not drinking a Coors Light, in 4 gulps and then opening another one. There's something about wine that's very, very slow, and that's meaningful. And so for us, it needed to be multi-serving. And then from that utility perspective, I looked at the canned wine market, and most of the canned wine that I had seen, besides the fact that I personally was not a fan of the quality, that, the wine was sweet, or it was, low quality in general. It tasted like I was going to get a hangover as I was drinking it. It was kind of sold on novelty. It was like, hey, here's something crazy and different. And I looked at it like, I could take that with me everywhere. One of my best friends is a river rafting guide, and he's a wine lover, and he duct tapes his wine bottles because he wants to bring great wine with him on the river. But if you break a glass bottle in a rubber boat, you've got a big problem on your hands, And so he certainly protects shards of glass from going anywhere. But if that glass still breaks, you still lost your wine. And so I really looked at the utility of it, and I said, this makes all the sense in the world. And there are other options. There's, boxed wine with that, reusable bag inside, et cetera. Aluminum is more sustainable. Aluminum has a higher recyclability state than those options. Aluminum by far was the lowest carbon footprint once the aluminum was generated, and aluminum is infinitely recyclable. And so from that perspective, there's no comparison to any other packaging. But really, it also was the utility of it. I mean, it was that I wanted to go places, and I wanted to have a nice glass of wine with me. One of my wife and my favorite endeavors. We've got kids, we've got busy lives, etc. In the summertime, we live down by the creek, and we can go take the dogs for a walk, and I can take a bottle of Revelshine and I can drop it in the creek, and we can walk the dogs up and back in 20 minutes and come back, and that bottle is ice cold, and I can pour 2 glasses of wine and we can watch the sunset, and I can seal that bottle shut. And if we're feeling really good and we want more, I can pour us more. And if not, we can bring the rest of it home with us. But that's not an advisable, you know, activity with a glass bottle on rocks and on a creek where, you're barefoot or your dogs are out running and stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. The utility of it is a big change. And I think people in the outdoor industry would appreciate the versatility that it allows. And so I know when we're looking at packaging, glass often may be associated with keeping things good longer and not tainting flavor. So I guess how did you kind of tackle that with the aluminum packaging and kind of people's perception of that?
So in the last arguably 5 to 7 years, aluminum and the level of money that has been invested into liners is in the hundreds of millions. I'm not the only one doing this. I mean, you look and now you see smart water moving to aluminum from plastic. You see, and when about a month ago, I was talking to a buyer in Whole Foods, and we were looking at their cold box section, not the wine section, but the cold box, because we were talking about putting, our rosé and our white wine in the cold area. And she said, yeah, within 12 to 18 months, over half of this is going to be aluminum. Everybody is moving in this direction, and at varying speeds. But because everyone is realizing now that depending upon the time frame within which you want to store your beverage, there's just no comparison to what you can do with aluminum. And so again, it's true that there's no other packaging that will store wine and allow wine to age from a quality perspective. If you're looking to age your wine 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 30 years, you need a glass bottle and you need a cork. You can't use a screw top for that. You need the cork. The cork allows that wine to slowly, it allows transpiration to occur. So there's this really, really microscopic level of oxidation occurring where that wine is breathing and it's evolving. And that doesn't happen in aluminum. That doesn't happen in boxed wine. And that doesn't happen with a screw cap. But again, when over 90% of the wine that's even sold or produced is consumed in less than a year, that just goes out the window.
Absolutely. So you mentioned that there's kind of a big shift in the beverage industry in general moving towards aluminum. So what is kind of inspiring that? How does it have to do with price? Does it have to do with similar to your versatility? Like you can bring it more places, it's more durable. Is it cheaper to ship? What is the general inspiration for that movement?
Sustainability. I
That's
mean,
just the bottom line.
everyone is realizing, on average, again, you and I are having this podcast in person. We enjoy a bottle of Revelshine together. I take it outside and I put it in my recycling bin. Roughly 60 days later, that's a new bottle. So this country in particular, not only is aluminum the only truly upcyclable material out there that it's infinitely recyclable. So that's number one. But then number two, this country has the infrastructure in place to so efficiently recycle aluminum versus anything else. A lot of states now don't recycle glass. And it doesn't mean that's not because we don't have the facilities to do it. It means by the time you take that bottle of glass that weighs a lot more and you transport it to the recycling center, you've already spent more energy than it's worth to recycle it. And so weight is a huge aspect of this, but you have to marry the weight aspect with that infinitely recyclable aspect, because you can't recycle a bag in a box the same way. That's a lower carbon footprint in the production and the transportation, but then most of that's being thrown away. Aluminum is the cleanest and purest, and even there, it's not perfect. I mean, if you want to have the lowest carbon footprint possible, you should really just not drink wine or most other beverages. But the next lowest scenario is to incorporate aluminum into that packaging.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you brought up that glass isn't recyclable in a lot of places. Where I live, they don't recycle glass either, for those exact reasons. So I think that's generally something that people may not necessarily consider. And so if you were to, I guess, give someone an elevator pitch about why Revelshine wines are the best option for an outdoor lifestyle, what would that be?
Well, I really quickly, I want you to ask me that question again in about 2 seconds, because I
Okay.
think we shouldn't get, I think this is interactive, right?
Yeah.
I'm freebasing here. I don't think we should skip over the extraordinary truth about glass that most people just don't know. And I'm not saying that to like knock the glass industry, but like, I live in Idaho. We don't recycle glass here. A lot of parts of Colorado, Montana, Alaska, there are a lot of states. I mean, your listeners could Google where glass is and is not recycled, and I think their jaws would drop. And then at the same time, I find it just so perplexing that in California they still offer money for glass. They offer a California redemption value and they buy the glass back. Where there's so much inefficiency around glass. And again, there's a time and a place for glass. I'm not saying that glass bottles or glass packaging should not exist. And it makes more sense if you bottled olive oil in glass that's going to sit on your countertop next to your stove for 6 weeks as you use a little bit of it to cook with. But if you part of the tragedy of wine in glass is not only that we consume it in less than a year, but also, you have a dinner party and you invite couples over and you're going to drink 3 bottles in a night. And so it's the rate of consumption mixed with how quickly that wine is in that bottle anyway. Glass is just, it really, really is not what people think it is. Now, if you lived really close to a winery or an olive oil factory or anywhere else, and you could reuse that same glass bottle, that would be arguably just about the holy grail. Because then you'd factor in that weight transfer and that weight, movement and stuff, and you'd build it into other things. And so reusing glass is a great option. But once you get into recycling glass, it really loses any, value from a sustainability perspective that's arguable. So I think it's important to point that out to people, regardless of whether they drink wine, regardless of whether they buy Revelshine. I'm always looking for alternative packaging other than glass personally now.
Yeah, same. I used to think that glass was like the end all be all best packaging. And then I started to learn more about it. And I was like, wow, I really shouldn't be focusing on that. So do you think the refilling economy might become more popular, or would that be something you would point consumers to, if they're trying to decide like which packaging maybe has a lower impact?
I mean, that's a really good question. And one of the hardest things about sustainability and carbon footprint is there's so many variables and so many factors to take into consideration, and you can slice and dice things in a lot of different directions. And I don't think from a commercial perspective, a commercial business can rely on refilling, because basically of just a distance between your consumers and where you're producing your product, whatever that might be. At a certain point, that just isn't going to be viable. And there's also some other issues in there just surrounding how a glass bottle with wine in particular would need to be cleaned or sanitized in between reusing it. If there's leftover wine that's been sitting in your hot cupboard for a week before you go to refill it and it's turned to vinegar, that's going to really taint your next bottle. There's just a lot of other things in there, both just from a straight feasibility perspective, but then also it could be the greatest winery or olive oil producer or anything else this side of the Mississippi. But if you live on that side of the Mississippi, it's not going to realistically fit into your life to drive to go get it refilled, and then you're using a bunch of fuel. I had a really interesting discussion, not argument, with a grower, a grape grower one time, who uses herbicides, and everybody was like, "Why do you do that? Why do you do that?" And he said, and he had created a machine that goes on the back of his tractor, where most people, when they use an herbicide in farming, it's called strip spraying. And you just run this strip and you spray chemicals, whether it be Roundup or anything else, any type of herbicide, um, all the way along the row. And it's nasty and it's unnecessary. He created this thing that would, and I don't know if he was using Roundup, and we don't even need to talk about Roundup specifically, but he created this scenario that um, it would just pop a little puff of this herbicide right where it needed to be around the vine, and then he let everything else be. And his argument was, I can do that one time, and it saves me 4 trips through with my tractor to keep those weeds down later, and that saves all that fuel from being burned. And I was like, oh man, you got me, because there's so many different ways that you can look at it. Do you want to Sustainability is hard, because you can argue on one front, from an agricultural perspective, you want to use no chemicals, you want to use no anything else. And I'm not advocating either way, but if you do that, you're going to be spending a lot more fuel with a tractor to maintain the same thing, or you're going to be using a lot more labor with shovels. But that may, increase the cost of your fruit to the point where you're not viable. And so I have empathy not only for myself, but for any consumer out there, to try to make the best decision these days, because it's not very clear. And I think that's why a lot of people still use glass and think they're doing the right thing.
Yeah, I agree. It's complicated, one, for the industry to decide what to do and like how to produce things, and then to trickle that information down to the consumer and distill it in a way that is easy to understand and consumable. It feels impossible at times. So it's it's nice when brands can clearly communicate those types of messages, so it's obvious to the consumer, and there's not a lot of like work that has to be involved on their end, because I think oftentimes the responsibility should be for the people producing the products and not necessarily for the people buying the products. You know what I mean?
I totally agree. And I think it's interesting too that oftentimes, I don't know if the producers necessarily even know, because you have to look at a producer of wine or a producer of kind of anything, and then they're relying on the people that they're buying the packaging from to a certain degree to inform them of what it is that they're buying and whatnot. And so you can kind of keep working your way backwards. But I know that we work as hard as we can every time we buy aluminum bottles to buy bottles that have the highest percentage of recycled aluminum in them. But that percentage can change from production run to production run. And there are varying aluminum producers who care more and or care less about using recycled aluminum versus virgin aluminum. And if I hadn't kind of unintentionally gotten the education that I had about this, I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't know the questions to ask. And it is incumbent upon me, acting as a commercial business, to put that time and effort into that education. But it's hard. It's hard. It's kind of hard for everyone. And so when you go multiple steps down the line all the way to the consumer, and I think about myself as a consumer walking into a grocery store or anywhere where I'm going to buy something, it kind of feels like, well, how do I, what bite of the elephant do I take here? I mean, this is huge. It's really challenging.
Yeah, it's difficult to decide and manage all of the information at once. And so, from what you've learned throughout your process creating Revelshine wines and your history in the wine industry in general, I guess, what are some of the lessons that you would want to communicate to other beverage producers of any kind about reevaluating their footprint and general sustainability practices.
Yeah, I am not proprietary about what we are doing. I'm in business. We've invested a lot to build this, but nothing would make me happier than to hopefully be the canary in the coal mine that proves the viability of this, not from sustainability, not from wine quality, not from utility, but from hearts and minds. So if we can prove that hearts and minds are willing to accept this enough so that other entities would follow our lead, nothing would make me happier. Because I can certain to a certain degree understand the decisions that a lot of other producers make, that hey man, hearts and minds say that's not what it works. But it takes someone to kind of be the first to try to prove that point differently. And hopefully then people follow. And then I just, you know, it is not an easy time business wise in this country or in this world right now. There's still a lot of challenges. There's still a lot of supply chain issues. We have changing weather patterns. We have global warming. It's not hard. It's not easy. And so again, I have empathy for anybody, not just a winemaker, who's trying to grow their lettuce or grow their strawberries in a new world, or whatever that may be. And but I still think that we all have a certain level of responsibility to do the best we can, to do the best that we can. And I hesitate to go past that, because I don't know the position that any individual grower or producer or business person's in, or what they're dealing with. But as long as they're doing the best that they can with the knowledge that they have. And I know personally, when I realized and came to the realization of the issue with glass, I can't beat myself up for producing wine commercially for decades prior in glass when I didn't know. But there's actually, a little bit of a sidebar here. We're a wine partner of Protect Our Winners, which is a really great political organization that helps with this, helps with environmental impacts and how to make decisions from a political perspective. And there was a movie that How produced this year, and it was about a woman who I've met a few times. Her name is Amy Engerbretson, and it's called. Actually, this is really funny, because now that I'm talking about it, now I can't remember the name of the movie because I'm focusing on it. Um, it's going to come to me, and I'm going to come back and I'll tell you that we don't have to cut it out. We can use this as the humorous part of my interview here. But it was all about how does she, as a professional athlete and a professional skier in the outdoor industry, Hypocrite is the name of the movie. How does she go out there, yet how does she get on a helicopter to take her out to some remote peak, or get on a snowmobile and go somewhere and use fossil fuels, when she's also claiming that she wants to protect that environment? And what the purpose of that film was, you really can't beat yourself up when you didn't know. But when you've learned, and when you do know, then it's really incumbent upon you to make the best decisions that you can moving forward. And if that means that she chooses to or not to get into a helicopter for her next movie, but she chooses to, take human powered methods instead, and skin up to the top of the mountain and still do what she does. And in the same regard for me, or any other producer in the wine industry, not knowing the impact that glass had to the same level, that's nobody's fault. And we're really wasting time and energy and life if we kind of try to look backwards. But now I think it's really incumbent on all of us to do the best we can, knowing that to move forward, to make different decisions.
That reminds me of, I don't remember who said it, but there's some saying that's like, once you know better, do better. And
Totally.
yeah, I just can't remember who it was, but that movie sounds really interesting. I'll have to check it out, and I'll be sure to link to it in the show notes too, if I can find it on the POW website or something like that.
I wish that you had said that before I had spent like 3 minutes trying to explain it in this long drawn out version, because that was about 8 words and you were perfect.
Yeah, I don't remember who said it, but that's a phrase that I think of quite often, and I think it is very impactful. If you like Revelshine's traditional approach to sustainable winemaking with an outdoor spirit, Jake and the Revelshine team are offering our listeners an exclusive 10% off their next order. Visit revelshinewines.com. That's REVELSHINEWINES.com. revelshinewines.com to check out all of their offerings and use the code OM10 to get 10% off your next order from Revelshine Wines. Something that you have kind of brought up throughout the conversation is the fact that the wine industry and you specifically need to work to change hearts and minds. And so I guess if we're looking at the elevator pitch idea, then I guess what would yours be to try to change consumers' hearts and minds about how they consume wine?
Well, I don't think that wine needs to be consumed only in the way that it traditionally has, which most people think that it's around a table with food, and that's all a wonderful thing, and that's the genesis of the culture. But I think that wine is a really unique beverage in and of itself, and I think it can be consumed anywhere. And I really encourage most consumers to think of where their table is. And if their table is a picnic table, or if their table's on the top of the mountain, or if it's on a beach, or if it's on a river, or if it's inside, and they just care that much about sustainability. But I encourage them to think of where their table is and give wine a shot in that fashion. And I also think I encourage them to, we're really asking people to keep 1 foot rooted in history and culture with arguably the oldest beverage there is, out there from an alcohol perspective. But we're also asking them to put 1 foot purely into the future and into now. It's really not the future, but now. And that's a request. That's certainly a request that not everyone is going to step up to. But I think that if they do, I think that they'll be pleasantly surprised to see that we're just taking wine beyond the boundaries of that traditional table. We're bringing it to new places. We're allowing people the ability through our packaging to experience it in a greater, variety of environments and in a more sustainable manner.
I love that. I love the idea of finding your table and where it's located, because sometimes that is outside on the top of the mountain. That's awesome. Cool. Well, I really enjoyed learning more about the background of Revelshine Wines and kind of your process and how you learned about all of these things. I think it's a great example for other brands to kind of dig into those specific aspects, and also good for listeners to kind of learn how someone who is producing these things that we love can make a difference. So how can listeners learn more about you and check out Revelshine Wines?
www.revelshinewines.com, and we're also on Instagram at Revelshine Wines. So check us out. And actually, I am so not a social media guy. We're actually at Revelshine. We're not at Revelshine Wines. So I almost said it wrong. I almost sent them to the wrong place, but it's a pretty easy Google search. They'll find us pretty quickly.
Absolutely. And I'll be sure to link that in the show notes. So if you're listening to this and you're not driving, you can just go down and click that and check them out there. But with that, thank you so much again, Jake, for taking the time to be on the show. And I hope everyone enjoyed the conversation as much as I did.
Thank you so much. I look forward to when we are in person and we can share a glass of wine together.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. You can find us on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book, on YouTube, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter at theoutdoorminimalist.com. For even more updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with the shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.